Welcome to the third webinar for Essential Sociology. This is getting ready for papers 1 and 3, and this is the theory section that we'll be covering today. Okay, so today's webinar structure is going to be as follows. So we're going to discuss some of the trickier areas within our theory section, and this is going to include looking at sociology as a science, which is quite a comprehensive one by which we're going to have to go through quite a lot of steps for. And then we're going to be looking at value freedom, understanding what it means and try to understand some different viewpoints associated with this particular topic. Then we are going to move on and understand some of the theoretical perspectives and what their view is on sociology as a science overall. And then we're going to practice how to structure and write responses to theory questions as well today. So what we're going to start off with today is the difficult areas that people might face. Now in today's webinar we'll be looking at the trickier topics such as debates around sociology as a science and value freedom. Now these are areas that often one of the students feel most uncomfortable with, as they tend to make them more complicated than they need to be. Now what we're going to try to do is make you feel that these topics are not as bad as you think they are. So we're going to try to make them a little bit simpler and easier to understand. Now, this debate around sociology as a science has been going on for a very, very long time, because for a length of time, sociologists have always struggled up against the fact that we have been considered non-scientific in nature, which means that our theories and our data that's being collected tends to be ridiculed rather than accepted as a social fact, as it were. Now the reason being why this occurred was during the 19th century, the natural sciences began to dominate our social world, and this was partly because they had the various technological improvements such as medicine come about and the ability to control nature. So this is, for example, the use of fossil fuels or the way in which we control and grow particular types of crops all became very dominant within our mind's eye. Now, positivists argue that we as sociologists should try to replicate the success the natural sciences have obtained by using similar methods. Now, when we're talking about methods, we're not just talking about research methods, as it were. We're talking about and replicating the ways in which they actually conduct research. So within a controlled setting, with hypotheses, with theories, and what type of method do they take to actually investigating. Now they argue that we will have the ability to claim social facts, so reasons as to why behaviour has occurred, and then we have the potential to eradicate things like poverty, inequality and conflict within society. This can only be done once sociology has obtained that magical status of being classified as scientific. Therefore, by identifying with science, we have the potential of making sociology more credible overall as a subject. Now, as a result of this particular assumption, this really solidified the positivist positions with the assumption that is very clear that external forces are responsible for shaping the man. So we are looking at how those external structures are going to influence the individual's behaviour. Therefore, social structures like schools, hospitals, social care networks would all be there exerting force, and therefore by doing so they are shaping the individual's behaviour based on their demands. So what we're seeing here very quickly is just a snapshot as to why we want sociology to be a science, because we want the credibility and we want the ability to claim social facts as well. Now this would mean positivists like Durkheim, as an example, are saying that sociology can be and should be seen as a science, but they should only focus on observable external factors, so these can explain why and how behaviour has occurred. Which then also as a result means any unobservable behaviour, so thoughts, feelings or emotions, should not be studied because they cannot be studied objectively, which means we cannot claim any scientific credibility to any conclusions that are drawn from this. Now what we're going to be moving on to now, we've outlined the initial debate as to why positivists want sociology to be considered a science. We're going to start to understand some of the additional little bits here and there. And this is going to involve looking at Karl Popper. Now, Karl Popper was a social philosopher who argues that we should take a deductive approach to studying human behaviour. This is where the hypothesis is supported and strengthened by constantly trying to falsify it. Now, however, in order for sociology to be considered scientific, it will need to use a hypothetico-deductive method. Now, this simply means creating hypotheses based on previous research, which then can be tested through additional research. Now, from this method, Popper suggests that science possesses 8 clear features. And what we're going to do is go through those 8 features now. Now, the first feature is hypotheses. Now, this is simply forming ideas or guesses about the cause's behaviour. Then what we lead into is falsification. So this is the ability to prove or disprove a hypothesis. Then we move into empirical evidence. Now, as stated, no hypothesis can be considered scientific without falsifications. Therefore, this can only be done through the use of empirical and measurable evidence, which is derived from systematic observations or experiments of only observable behaviour. Then we focus on replication. Now, this is where the empirical evidence must have the ability to be replicated to verify the accuracy of the findings. Now, this will allow us then also to falsify the information more so. Then we move on to accumulation of evidence. Now, this is scientific knowledge is cumulative, which means it develops through a constant cycle of hypothesis formation, falsification, and empirical data and new hypothesis testing. Now, by doing so, we're going to have the ability to make a prediction. Now, this is through the use of evidence that is rooted in empirical data will allow for cause and effect relationships to be established, which means we can make predictions based on future behaviour. Now, this is only possible because of everything else that we've done previously. So use of hypotheses, the ability to falsify, replication, and the accumulation of evidence all allow us to make predictions about behaviour. Then what we see, all of this comes together quite quickly into theory formulation. Now, if you are unable to prove the theory against evidence, the predictions appear sound, and then it would become part of scientific theory because we've had the ability to test it over and over again, be able to replicate it, falsify it, and they've remained stable, the findings, which means overall they have become scientific in nature because we've replicated it and we have found nothing that disproves it. And then what we find on the last step overall. Now, this step is the most important in terms of scientific thinking and the community. This is the process regarding scrutiny. Now, scrutiny is absolutely essential because we're going to be looking at theories, we're going to be looking at the hypotheses, we're going to be looking at the evidence, and we're really going to start to try to rip it apart. We're going to try to see if this theory can remain true against other scientists scrutinizing it. Now, only then, once we've got the ability to test this and scrutinize it, can we argue that this theory is scientific, because other people have looked at it and criticized it and said, hang on here, is this right? Now, the theory and the hypothesis will only remain true until new evidence emerges that then can therefore disprove the theory overall. Now, what we've just outlined here is the hypothetico-deductive method. We can see that it goes through the hypothesis and all the way through to scrutiny, which then allows for us to make an informed decision based on research that this hypothesis, this research, can be considered scientific in nature. Now, this is the first step that Popper argues that needs to be taken for sociology to be considered scientific. It needs to follow these steps, these processes, in order for us to get that higher status within and compared to other subjects like the natural sciences, so chemistry, biology, physics, and even to some extent even against psychology now. Now, Popper led us to have this discussion about this hypothetico-deductive method and why it was so essential in order for sociology to be considered scientific. Now, he argues and he focuses on one of the main processes which he identified within that 8-stage process. Now, the main area that he tended to focus on was the principle of falsification. Now, he argues it is absolutely essential for scientific thought to be falsified. So the reason behind this is there needs to be a degree of rigor and skepticism about the research and the application of the research. So we need to have the ability to prove it correct or incorrect. And he argues that we shouldn't simply aim to prove a hypothesis correct, but rather look for evidence to prove a hypothesis false. Now, by doing so, what we are seeing here is rigorous scientific thought being applied to the research, by which most sociological investigations have failed to do so. Now, he argues that the knowledge that survives rigorous testing can be tentatively accepted as real scientific proof. Now, why we're saying tentatively there is we can only accept it as truth for as long as it can be proven correct or incorrect. Now, this means overall, Popper is saying for us, we need to ensure that this falsification is an absolute priority. Now that we've outlined the idea of principal falsification and why it's so essential, let's see how Popper actually views sociology as a science. Now, Popper is sceptical about sociology's status as a science, is often too theory-based and not sufficiently engaged in testing and research, so therefore it's lacking some of those processes mentioned in that hypothetico-deductive method. Although this could have been the case when Popper was writing, it could be argued that contemporary sociologists apply a new level of rigour that has partly, in turn, made us similar to the natural sciences. However, we need to acknowledge that even if this is the case, there are still some pieces of research that will not match and meet the principle of falsification because they focus on the idea of internal thoughts, and therefore it's difficult for us to objectively analyse and study things like thoughts, feelings and emotions put forth by an individual. So this is where Popper's sceptical view about sociology's status as a science can be seen as still relevant within some of our modern day research, as it were. Now we're going to move on to a slightly different angle in terms of what we're looking at for sociology as a science. We're going to start to look at what the realists say about sociology's status as a science. Now, realists like Sayers and Keats and Urry claim that both positivists and interpretivists have misunderstood what science actually is. They argue that most behaviour has not been observed, it has been worked out by looking at observable effects. Now, for example here, deviant behaviour is observed as a result of maybe the socio-demographic makeup of society at that point, and then they're seeing what area the individual lives in, and then seeing how the individual responds to these factors. Now, obviously what we can see here is the effects of their deviant behaviour is a result of maybe their class and the area by which they live in, rather than it being something a lot more scientific than that. Now, Sayer continues this discussion, and he argues that many sciences theorise about the existence of phenomena which are too difficult to observe or predict. Now, he argues sciences assumes the position of a closed system which allows for precise measurement as all variables are controlled within an artificial environment. So this is our typical assumption as to how we are looking at in terms of scientific thought and structure. However, some of the natural sciences do not use the same system as sociology, which is considered to be an open system. Now, this means it's not as controlled and it's difficult to make predictions due to other variables potentially influencing the results. As well as that, we tend to also focus on unobservable human behaviour. So therefore, we cannot draw objective conclusions like a closed system can generate. Now, this is the realist viewpoint here. Now, we're going to see how they would argue, is sociology a science? Now, from what Sayer would suggest, it seems that sociology is unscientific since it is unable to make reliable predictions about human behaviour. Both the natural sciences and sociology try to explain unobservable human behaviour within an open system where control is not possible. They argue that we should not attempt to assume the techniques of the natural sciences, but instead follow an alternative path. Now, what they're arguing here is we need to be a bit of trailblazers. We need to focus on creating our new methods which allow for us to test the unique phenomena that happen within our societies. Therefore, but once we have dealt with this issue, can sociology overcome the barrier of being declared as non-scientific, and it can then pursue this idea of scientific behaviour and understanding for human behaviour? Now, Kuhn comes into our discussion. Now, he's a scientific historian. Now, he argues that scientists are not these open individuals as positivists would claim, since they are led by paradigms. Now, paradigms very simply are a set of assumptions about the natural world and what priorities there are when researching. So a paradigm would be absolutely influential in dictating how current phenomena are understood or explained based on that particular viewpoint that is dominant. So right now, if we were going to try to explain most of human behaviour, we would look at trying to explain it through biological natures. So as try to look at organisms, germs, viruses, and explain this is why and how an individual is behaving. Now, for us, this also is led within sociology. So our most dominant paradigms would be, is it an interpretivist paradigm or is it a positivist paradigm? Are we more functionalist at some points? And this in itself will also dictate how we would be researching as a subject overall. Now, Kuhn argues that scientific progress occurs when evidence has been collected which overthrows the dominant paradigm. So what we're going to see here is once there has been a process of verification about the particular paradigm at that point, and there is enough evidence that is overwhelming to overthrow the paradigm, this means by that point we have got the potential of a scientific revolution taking place within our subjects. So therefore this means we will be considered more scientific as a result of this. Now let's look at Kuhn's view on sociology as a science. Now Kuhn would argue that sociology wouldn't be scientific as it does not rely solely on one established paradigm. Sociology is comprised of multiple competing theoretical perspectives which intensely oppose one another. So therefore what we're seeing there isn't one dominant that is dictating and controlling. It's going to mean that we're going to have a narrowing down of which theoretical perspectives are controlling our research aims and understandings. Then only by this chance will we be able to be considered scientific once this has been done. Now, postmodernists start to enter this discussion about can sociology be considered a science? But the first thing that they really want to argue against is that there is no absolute and universal truth offered by science, because at the end of the day, they are trying to provide us with meta-narratives to the big stories of life that allow for our society to be explained in a way that makes an individual feel better. Now, they're particularly critical of science claims to be objective, as the knowledge collected is often subjective and reflects the interests of the powerful groups in society. So this means that the rules of rational thinking and scientific logic is a tool with which the powerful try to control ways of thinking of the wider society. So this means they'll be looking at the ways in which current research is going to understand actually why has this been implemented and who does it actually benefit. Because at the end of the day, alongside this, science is influenced by other social factors as well. So we're going to be looking at funding, so the university's aims and directions regarding particular research subjects, career aspirations of individuals. So are they going to be trying to represent a very dominant school of thought in a very sneaky way of trying to ensure that they progress quite rapidly within their career? Now, all of this needs to be taken into account, because this in itself would argue quite heavily that this universal truth and objective truth offered by the natural sciences and science in general is completely false. Now let's look at their viewpoints on sociology as a science. Now, they argue that sociology should abandon any pursuit of being scientific, since there is no single scientific truth out there. They argue for a pluralistic approach to inquiry, which uses a range of techniques that capture the many interpretations of society and reality. So why don't we use those magical methods that allow for us to capture the quantitative data as well as that brilliant qualitative data? And by using both of those, we're going to get a much richer, rounded form of research and view on society, rather than just focusing on that evidence which is quantitative, statistical, because it is seemingly more objective in nature. Let's use something which makes us as a subject more worthwhile and unique compared to the other subjects by which are not objective, even though that they are claiming to be so. Now, as a result of everything that we've gone through, I think it was very important for us just to give you a quick snapshot of all the arguments that we have so far discussed. So what we can see at the top of this slide, we've got positivism, interpretivism and postmodernism there. And then we have got down the other side, sociology as a science, so their viewpoint, yes or no, why, and the explanation behind this as well. I'm just going to quickly run through those just so you've got the snapshot arguments as to what's going on. So positivism, so obviously they see sociology as a science, that it's got the potential. Now, why do they argue this? Is because more scientific methods have been used to allow for facts and theories to be developed. Now, this means for us, we're seeing more objectivity entering into our profession, into our subject area, which is that and very similar to of the natural sciences. Now, even with consciousness being introduced, we can still study structures and how they can shape behaviour. So therefore, we can see the impacts of how the social care system would create a particular individual's behaviour. Then we've got interpretivism. They see sociology as non-scientific. They don't want us to be scientific in nature because that's where we lose that brilliant insight that we've gained as a subject. Now, sociology is a different subject compared to those natural sciences, as the subject matter is completely different and it's more complex, because what we're trying to understand here is people and their consciousness. We're trying to find out and discover their finite details about how and why they feel and behave the way that they do. The only way in which we can do this is by gaining Verstehen. Now, by doing this, we can start to empathize and understand that human behavior in a way which the natural sciences and science in general cannot offer us the ability to do so. So in terms of interpretivism, we don't want science, we don't want to be scientific, because then that's where we lose the value of our subject. Now, obviously, postmodernists, they argue no, sociology cannot be considered scientific. We should try to reject this idea of being scientific overall, as we've just discussed. Now, sociological theories are just meta-narratives. They are big stories about life at that moment of time. Now, what we're seeing here is these meta-narratives are reflecting what's potentially going on, but more so it's only reflecting what the dominant group wants us to believe. So no form of scientific knowledge is truth, because we cannot guarantee that it is going to be based on objective and rational thought, which is why the postmodernists argue that we should reject this pursuit of being considered scientific, and we should blaze our own path, and we should create and use methods that allow us to create a value subject rather than a subject that is trying to be a replication of another area. Now, what we can see there is this is just a little snapshot as to what's going on in terms of the theoretical debates in terms of sociology as a science. Now that we've covered sociology as a science, we're going to be looking at value freedom, so values and sociology, and we're going to start to just understand the different viewpoints that are going on with this. Now, value freedom is the argument that any research that is conducted should be aiming for complete value freedom, which means that none of the researcher's own ideas or biases or prejudices are entering the research. Now, the reason behind this is because we want to be seen as more scientific in nature. So we're going to apply the same principles of objectivity and rational thought in doing so. By only doing this can we consider our research to be more credible overall. Now, the first argument that we're going to be discussing in terms of value freedom or values in sociology is Comte, and the ideas that he brings forward are very interesting. Now, Comte is both a functionalist and a positivist, so we need to obviously know who he is, and you might have seen his name appear many a time throughout the course. Now, he argues that sociology should aim for value freedom in research, as this enables the subject to have status and authority, similar to that of the natural sciences, because this is what we should be aiming for as a subject. Now, this will enable sociology to be considered an impartial, objective source of information, which means that everything is not based on one researcher's viewpoint of the world. This is objective information that then can be applied to the wider society. And this is what the natural sciences have done, and this is what we're trying to replicate. Now, the next area we're going to be looking at is Weber. Now, Weber argues, he's an interpretivist in nature, that in order for us to conduct sociological research, it's essential for values to be taken into account. Now, the places that he argues values are essential is if we look at values as guiding us into research, these help us choose the aspects of our social life that we want to study, and this therefore informs our decision. Whilst when it comes around to data collection, Weber argues that our values should be removed from this, because therefore it stops any subjectivity interfering. Now, when the values come back into place is within our data interpretation. Now, this means that we have to put these findings within a theoretical concept overall. This means that this can influence the way that we interpret what the research is telling us. And what we need to tell others about is that these are interpretations and we need to put them into context to what we have discovered. And then we have the values and the effects of the research. Now, we have a responsibility as research to look out for the effects of what's happened as a result of the conclusions that we have made. And we should try to find out what harm has potentially been caused within our society. This is where Weber gets really passionate, because he says that researchers should stop hiding behind value, freedom and objectivity. And by doing so, ignoring the impact that their findings have on society. They should take responsibility for the harm that they have caused with their research. So in terms of what we're saying here is you should acknowledge that values have been influencing your research and bringing this awareness into the process itself. Now, Kuhn brings in a new argument in terms of value freedom. He argues that value freedom is only present when powerful groups consider it to be present in itself. If we generate a piece of research that is going to threaten or compromise their position within society or within certain groups, then this powerful group will portray this research as subjective and therefore unreliable. So therefore, if we're going to be looking at something like Marxism, say if we were going to generate a piece of research which say that the capitalist infrastructure is the root of all evil, these powerful groups who are capitalist in nature would do their very best to try to disprove this point. By doing so, they are obviously saying that that research is subjective and unreliable, and therefore we should not be taking it seriously. Now, these are the three basic arguments as to when we're looking at value freedom, because we can see the value freedom comes in and influences a lot of how we view and how we interpret information and research as well. Now, what we need to acknowledge here is within paper 1 and 3, you do have the potential of being asked about research methods and theory. So if you look at paper 1 there, you've got a lovely 10-mark question at the end of that entire paper. Now, this 10-mark question will be a 15-minute question, as it were, so you only have 15 minutes to answer it, and it will be an outline and explain two advantages or disadvantages of ... in sociological research. Now, this could be value freedom, it could be sociology as a science type discussion as well. Now, what you have to acknowledge within this type of question, all of the assessment objectives will be expected to be used. So this would be AO1 to understanding, AO2 application, AO3 evaluation and analysis will all need to be present. Meanwhile, on paper 3, there is a theory or methods extended question as well. Now, within that paper 3, when we're talking about the methods section, it's not going to be as explicit as a methods in context. It's going to be a question that might ask you about particular methods in terms of a theoretical discussion, as it were. And you will be given an item with this question. So obviously use the item to its fullest to ensure that you're integrating it into your answer. Now, the time that will be given for this particular question will be only 30 minutes. So it's significantly less than what you'll be given for that 30 marker. Now, again, within this question, you will have the AO1, AO2 and AO3 skills that are absolutely crucial that you use and apply. Now, the AO2 skill will be absolutely paramount within this question because you will be given an item. Now, this item has to be used explicitly and obviously within your answer. Now, what we're going to focus on first is the 20 marker. Now, for a 20 marker, you will be expected to obviously have a very clear structure. Now, within this particular question, you need to have an introduction and a conclusion. So if you are aiming for the top band in terms of your marks, you need to ensure conclusion is included. Now, a conclusion is essential in this viewpoint. Now, what we're looking at here in terms of the essay structure is the introduction. This is where you're going to take some time to identify the key terms and introduce a brief overview of the main positions in the essay. Now, this is where we have to do this really magical and concise thing about signposting. Now, when we talk about signposting, this is just giving the examiner a general direction as to where you're going to take the discussion within the essay structure itself. Then you will have the main body. Now, where this is only a 20 mark question, you have to be very cautious that you're not overcomplicating because you don't have the time to do so. It's difficult for me to say to you there is a definite amount of paragraphs by which you have to write, but if we look at something like the methods in context question, you are only going to be writing 3 substantial paragraphs for that particular essay question. But just realise the depth and detail within those essay questions is quite substantial. So when we're looking at this main body, what we are going to have to see is making sure that if you are outlining the discussion, it is done in a way that depth and detail is given to a really great level. And then the conclusion. Make sure this is the last major fundamental argument by which is essential for defining the topic overall. So if we were going to take sociology as a science as an example, I'll definitely be using postmodernism as my last discussion point because it brings it all to life that one step further, and I can just really end on a chunky, nice piece of information there. Now, it has to be something new, and it has to also provide an ultimate end to your essay. Now, that can also be provided by your wording, so make sure that the wording that is used is conclusive in nature. It is also not explanatory in nature, as it were. The essay structure hints and tips here, so this is just us taking it one step further. So make sure the theories and concepts are defined and well explained. So if you're asked to talk about value freedom or what science is, make sure you've got a nice definition as to what they actually mean. Ensure key theorist content is identified and explained. Now, if you do so happen to forget the names, that is okay. It's more about the content in itself. So, for example, if you're going to say Comte and you refer to him as a positivist and explain his viewpoints, that is fine. Now, obviously, Kuhn, you have to make sure that his main key ideas about paradigms are all linked in and explained to a great level of detail. So it's about making sure that the information that you're providing is detailed, accurate and concise, rather than it just being a general overview with no link to actually what they've said. Be clear and coherent with your explanation of the theory overall. So make sure that you're taking that time to ensure that accuracy is there, that is well detailed, it's got the depth to it that is required. Make sure you write your conclusion, as I've said right there on the other slide. Is absolutely essential, and do not neglect the item and the context that is given to you. It's been given to you as a gift by the examiners, so make sure that you are utilizing it and introducing it and encouraging it within your answer overall. Now, this is a 20 mark question example, as you can see here, for a theory question. Now, what we can see there is right at the top, you have got a lovely item that's been provided to you. Now, what you'll notice and how it is different compared to the other items that you've encountered so far, so for the 20 mark for methods in context, this item is slightly smaller in nature. So right at the top there, you can see that it's giving you a couple trigger points as to what you could potentially use in your answer. So you obviously need to ensure that you're picking them up and using them as an example. And then at the bottom, you've got one additional sentence. Now this sentence will help to give you greater clarity as to what maybe one of the previous sentences have stated. So it allows you to develop the viewpoint that little bit further. Now we can see with the question as well, it asks you some very key buzzwords there. So you apply material from the item and your knowledge and evaluate the view that sociology is scientific as the natural sciences. Now that for us is an absolutely wonderful question because it's giving you very clearly you have to use your item and your knowledge on sociology as scientific. There we go. That's all we've got to do, and make sure that we're linking it back to those natural sciences throughout our answer as well. Now the structure for this particular essay can be one by which everyone starts to worry about. And what we've tried to do today is give you a clear introduction as to how you could potentially deal with this overall. So first things first, you need to define and discuss what is meant by the term science. Now obviously science is a system that is objective in nature by which you can claim social facts about the world. And now what you need to do there is just bring that to life a little bit more so by outlining that there are different perspectives within sociology that have debated the likelihood that sociology can be considered scientific. Now this is where you're going to bring in the positivist and interpretivist ideas just to bring it to life that one step further. From here, then you discuss all those wonderful arguments that we've so far spoken about today. So you bring in the Popper, Kuhn and Sayer stuff that we've done so far, as well as that then bring in the arguments about value freedom in research and actually why this is so problematic. So we talk about the Weber, the Comte and the Gom stuff that we've done through as well. Now within the conclusion, discuss difficulties in considering sociology to be a science. So this is where I would introduce postmodernist ideas, which can state that sociology can be only considered scientific if powerful groups deem it to be so. So you're bringing in an interesting new discussion into the whole essay overall. Now by doing so, what you're doing there is bringing together all that wonderful stuff that you've spoken about for interpretivists and the positivists, and ending it on this really nice new note, because the postmodernist discussion will give us that little edge as to our understanding and our knowledge. However, even though we focused quite a lot down on the 20-mark question, we mustn't ignore this wonderful 10-mark question that you will be expected to answer as well. Now, the 10-mark question is very simple in terms of its approach. You need to identify and explain all keywords or concepts that are given to you. So make sure you're elaborating and bringing it to life even more so. Make sure those theory and concepts are mentioned if they're hinted within the question. Don't ignore them, and I can't really stress that enough. Within this as well, be clear and coherent with your response. So make sure you've got a good structure approach to this. Now again, with the 10-mark question, you only have to really write 2 really chunky paragraphs explaining what and how the question's asking you to deal with. Now, you do not need to write a conclusion or introduction. Now, they are not necessary. Now, I argue to an extent that I'd always write a small introduction. Now, the reason behind that is, even though it's not necessary, it allows for me to write a very, very brief introduction which allows for me to introduce some of my main concepts and my basic knowledge. So if they're asking me to define what positivism is, I quickly define what positivism is and then write a next 2 or 3 sentences detailing what my argument's going to be, and then I'm going to move straight into my paragraphs, and I will not have to worry about conclusions, and do not waste time writing one either. Now, the best way in which you can deal with this type of question is by using a structure which we've created, which is what we call the sociological sandwich. Now, we're just going to go through some of the stages within the sociological sandwich now. Now, what you can see with the sociological sandwich here is, it's got all of the layers of a sandwich. So we've got the top slice. We talk about the advantage or disadvantage as to what we're being asked to look at for the question. Make sure that we are bringing that to life and making it explicitly clear at the top. The garnish, use an example to elaborate on your initial points. So can you bring a theorist into your discussion? Can you bring an example of a case study that you know of? Or just a general example that you can bring in to make it even clearer that you understand what's being asked. Then the main filling, link it back to questions here. So what you need to be is bringing it back to why this is an advantage and the demands of the question overall. Now the bottom slice is where you are going to do some of the higher level thinking, as it were, which is essential. Now you're going to start to analyse the extent that this is actually an advantage. Is there any similar or supporting evidence that you can provide that will make your points even greater? Or will there be other information that you can provide that can potentially contradict it? Which means actually, should we really be considering this as a valid viewpoint? How accurate is the information that is being portrayed? Now, this is the structure by which will allow for you to deal with the demands of that 10 marker really quickly and concisely. Now, let's apply the sociological sandwich to a question. So the question for a rough example here is outline and describe 2 arguments that sociology should only use objective and value-free research. This is absolutely fantastic, really, when we think about it as a question. And now what we've got to do there is say, okay, there's 2 arguments, so I've only got to do 2 paragraphs, and I've got to define objectivity and value-free research. So I've got to make sure my whole of my paragraphs relate back to this. Now what you can see right at the top there, we've got the case for objectivity was put forward by early positivism of Comte and Durkheim. They sought to appear scientific in order to reveal the truth about how society works. A good example of this is Durkheim's assertion that suicide is a social fact. Weber agreed that research must strive for objectivity throughout the data collection process and avoid any potential influence over their findings. Weber agreed but pointed out that research cannot be entirely free of value judgments, since choice of topics is influenced by what the researcher or the funding body considers to be important. Regarding the issue of truth, postmodernists take the relative viewpoint that no sociological perspectives can claim a monopoly on the truth, since all knowledge is based on values and assumptions. Which means for us here, what you're going to see there is that sociology can try to use objective and value-free research, but we're linking it back to the idea of postmodernists that nobody can claim that complete truth overall. Now that is the end of today's webinar, so obviously keep up to date with all future events in terms of webinars for ourselves. You can go to the tutor2.net sociology events and we'll be updating them regularly. As well as that, follow us on Twitter. We can spread the word and it just keeps you up to date with what's going on with the website. We have recently just created our student Facebook group as well, so this is A-Level Sociology Student Group. Search us and obviously click join. If you have got any questions or you want additional support or guidance, contact us on Facebook or Twitter and we're obviously happy to help you there as well. And that leads us to the end of the webinar today. Thank you very much for listening.